Most people think a blackout is an inconvenience. A few dark hours, candles on the table, phones on low battery, maybe a funny story to tell at work the next morning. That version of a blackout is real. It happens all the time. But it is not the only version. The version nobody talks about, the one that quietly rewrites everything, is the blackout that does not end after 6 hours. The one that stretches into day 2, day 3, a week. These events are not rare. They are documented, recurring, and increasingly common across the United States. And what makes them different from the short ones is not just the duration. It is what your home begins to lose, slowly and silently, while you are still waiting for the lights to come back on. This is not a video about the first hour. Candles and flashlights will get you through the first hour. This is about what happens after that. The systems and resources and invisible structures that hold your home together. Structures you never think about because they have never failed you, begin to degrade one by one. Some of them you will notice immediately. Others will slip away so gradually that you will not realize they are gone until you need them and they are not there. There are 11 of them, and by the time we reach number 1, you may find yourself thinking less about the blackout itself and more about the question nobody wants to ask before it starts. How long can my home actually function without power? Let us find out. The first thing your home begins to lose is temperature stability, and it starts faster than most people expect. Modern homes are not built to hold temperature passively. They are built to be actively managed. The walls, the insulation, the windows, all of it was designed with the assumption that a mechanical system, either a furnace or an air conditioner, would be running in the background, correcting every shift before it became noticeable. When that system goes offline, the correction stops. And what happens next depends entirely on what the outside air is doing. In winter, a well-insulated house will begin losing internal temperature at a rate of roughly 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit per hour under typical conditions. That sounds slow until you do the math. If your home is at 68 degrees when the power fails and the outside temperature is in the 20s, you have somewhere between 8 and 12 hours before the indoor temperature drops into the low 50s. That is before any pipes are at risk, before anyone is in danger. But it is also before most people have started to take the situation seriously. What few people understand is that temperature loss is not linear. It accelerates. The colder your home gets, the faster it loses heat, because the temperature differential between inside and outside increases. So, the first few hours feel manageable. The last few hours before real danger arrives feel like someone opened a window that will not close. Summer works in reverse, but the danger arrives faster. In a heat emergency, a home without air conditioning can reach dangerous internal temperatures within a few hours, particularly in upper floors and rooms with poor ventilation. The Centers for Disease Control has documented cases where indoor temperatures exceeded outdoor temperatures by 15 degrees or more, simply because heat became trapped and had nowhere to go. During the 2003 European heat wave, an event that killed over 70,000 people across the continent, many of the fatalities occurred in enclosed indoor spaces that had been treated as refuges rather than recognized as heat traps. The practical difficulty here goes beyond comfort. It touches medication storage, food safety, sleep quality, and the cognitive clarity that people need to make good decisions during an extended emergency. A household that has lost temperature control has also begun to lose, slowly, its ability to think clearly and function effectively. Most people with any level of preparedness own blankets and fans. Far fewer have thought through what those tools actually accomplish across 48 or 72 hours of real temperature loss, or what it means for a household that includes elderly relatives, infants, or someone with a chronic health condition that affects thermoregulation. But temperature is something you can feel. It announces itself. The next thing your home loses during a long blackout is something most families do not notice until it is already gone. The second thing is safe water pressure, and the timeline is shorter than most people realize. The water that comes out of your faucet feels independent of the power grid. You turn the handle. Water flows. It seems like a purely mechanical relationship. But in most American communities, that is not how it works. Municipal water systems depend on electrically powered pumping stations to maintain pressure throughout the distribution network. When power is lost across a wide area, those pumps stop, or they switch to backup generators that have limited fuel and limited runtime. According to the American Water Works Association, most water utilities are designed with backup power capacity ranging from 24 to 72 hours. After that window, the situation varies dramatically depending on the size of the utility, the availability of fuel resupply, and the coordination between the water authority and emergency management. In major disasters, fuel resupply for water utility generators has been interrupted for days. After Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, significant portions of the island lost water service entirely, and restoration for some communities took months, not days. What makes this particularly dangerous is the behavior that pressure loss creates at the household level. When water pressure drops below a certain threshold, the physical barrier that normally prevents contamination from entering the distribution system is compromised. Utilities are required to issue boil water advisories under these conditions, but those advisories depend on their own communication infrastructure, which may also be impaired during a major event. Most families keep very little stored water. The standard guidance from FEMA calls for 1 gallon per person per day for a minimum of 3 days. A family of 4 would need 12 gallons as a baseline. Most homes have none, and the water stored in a hot water heater, which some emergency guides recommend as a backup source, is only reliably safe to use if the tank is relatively new, well-maintained, and the heater has not lost its anode rod to corrosion. Older tanks can contain sediment and bacterial contamination that is normally masked by the continuous heating cycle. Without power, that cycle stops too. There is also the question of toilet function. In a gravity-fed system, you can flush once or twice using water poured directly into the bowl. But in homes on well water, or in areas with low system pressure, even that option disappears quickly. Sanitation, which feels like the most basic function of a modern home, can become the most urgent practical problem within 24 hours. The families who understand this ahead of time fill bathtubs, fill large containers, have a water bob or a similar emergency bladder that can hold up to 100 gallons. The families who don't are the ones standing at a closed gas station 2 days into an emergency, trying to buy cases of bottled water that sold out in the first 4 hours. Water is physical. You can see when it stops. The next thing your home loses is something you cannot see at all, which is part of what makes it so dangerous. The third thing your home loses during a long blackout is food safety margin, and it disappears in a way that is almost completely invisible. Refrigerators are not preservation systems. They are delay systems. They slow bacterial growth by maintaining a temperature that makes it harder for microorganisms to reproduce. Once that temperature begins to climb, and a refrigerator that has lost power will begin warming within 2 to 4 hours, the margin starts shrinking. The USDA's food safety guidance is precise on this point. Any perishable food that has been held above 40 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 2 hours should be discarded. 2 hours. Most blackouts last longer than 2 hours. Most people do not start worrying about their refrigerator until the 4th or 5th hour, which is already past the safety window for some of what is inside. The deeper problem is what happens to the food that looks fine. This is where the real danger lives. Bacterial contamination that reaches unsafe levels does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Chicken that has been in the temperature danger zone for 6 hours may look the same, smell the same, and feel the same as it did when it was safe. The organisms responsible for foodborne illness, Salmonella, Listeria, Clostridium perfringens, do not produce visible changes in texture or color at the stages of growth that make food dangerous. They are there, but they are invisible. The CDC estimates that 48 million Americans experience foodborne illness in an average year. That number tends to spike in the weeks following major power events. After Hurricane Irene struck the northeastern United States in 2011, public health officials recorded significant increases in foodborne illness reports in affected counties, almost entirely attributable to the consumption of food that households had decided was still safe to eat. The financial stakes here are real and underappreciated. The average American household loses somewhere between $200 and $400 in perishable food value during an extended blackout. That is real money. And the pressure it creates, the reluctance to throw away that much food, is part of what drives people to make decisions that make them sick. A fully stocked chest freezer kept closed can maintain food at safe temperatures for 48 to 72 hours. A full refrigerator holds safe temperatures for 4 hours. Most families treat these two appliances as equivalent, which they are not. Understanding the difference and having a dry ice source identified in advance is a distinction that separates a manageable food emergency from a genuine health risk. The next thing your home loses during a long blackout is something that most families never think of as connected to the power grid at all. But it is. The fourth thing is communication reliability, and it erodes in a pattern that creates a very specific kind of isolation. The first hour of a blackout, most people can communicate freely. Cell phones are charged, towers are running on battery backup, Wi-Fi routers are dead, but cellular data still works. You can call, you can text, you can check the news. The world feels connected even though the lights are off. By hour 4 to 6, the picture begins to change. Cell towers have backup battery systems that typically provide 4 to 8 hours of runtime. After that, towers need generator support. The major carriers, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, have invested significantly in generator capacity and fuel logistics, but coverage during extended outages is uneven. The FCC has documented repeated failures of cellular infrastructure during major disasters, with some towers going dark within 12 hours of a widespread outage. What makes this particularly disorienting is the way it happens. You do not lose connectivity all at once. You lose it tower by tower in a patchwork pattern. You might get through a call, then fail. Send a text, then get no delivery confirmation. Load half a news page, then get a timeout. This partial connectivity is in some ways worse than complete silence, because it keeps you in a state of anxious waiting, burning your phone battery trying to stay connected to information you cannot reliably reach. The Federal Communications Commission's inquiry after Hurricane Sandy in 2012 found that approximately 25% of cell sites in the affected area were out of service at the peak of the outage. In some counties, that number reached 80%. The households that maintained reliable communication were the ones with battery-powered NOAA weather radios, hand-crank emergency radios, or deliberate plans to preserve device batteries through the early phase of the outage. Landlines, for those who still have them, are a more complicated story. Traditional copper wire landlines can maintain service during power outages because the power comes from the telephone exchange rather than the home. But most modern homes with phone service use VoIP or fiber-based systems, and those require power at the home router to function. When the router dies, the phone dies with it. Many families believe they have a landline fallback and discover during an emergency that what they actually have is a phone that is just as dependent on electricity as everything else. The specific item that most preparedness guides underemphasize here is not a charger or a power bank. It is a battery-powered AM/FM NOAA weather radio. These devices receive broadcast signals that do not depend on cellular or internet infrastructure. They are the one communication channel that is most likely to remain functional after everything else has failed. And they are available at most hardware stores for under $30. Most families do not own one, but even when communication begins to fail, most households still have their lighting, at least for a while. The fifth thing your home loses is light itself, and the way it happens matters more than most people think. The fifth thing is reliable light, and the loss is more gradual and more psychologically significant than people expect. In the first hours of a blackout, lighting is the thing most families handle best. Candles appear. Flashlights are found, eventually. Phones become flashlights. The house is dark, but it is navigable. Dinner can be prepared. Kids can be put to bed. The situation is inconvenient, but manageable. By day 2, the landscape shifts. Candles have burned down. Flashlight batteries, particularly the AA batteries in cheap flashlights that have been sitting in a drawer for 2 years, begin to fail. Phone batteries, already stressed by the attempt to maintain connectivity, are being rationed. The house is now genuinely dark in ways that create real hazards. Fall and trip injuries spike during extended blackouts. The National Safety Council has documented this pattern across multiple large-scale outage events. Injuries from navigating darkened homes, particularly stairways, bathrooms, and kitchens, account for a significant share of blackout-related emergency room visits. These are not dramatic injuries. They are the result of someone trying to get a glass of water at 2 a.m. in a house where every light source has been consumed or rationed into darkness. The candle hazard, which most people consider the safe alternative, is real and documented by the National Fire Protection Association. The NFPA reports that candles are responsible for an estimated 8,000 residential fires per year in the United States under normal conditions. That number increases during extended power outages, because fatigued people are leaving candles burning in places they would not normally leave them. Bedrooms, bathrooms, on surfaces that are not designed to hold heat safely. A significant percentage of the catastrophic residential fires that have followed major hurricane events in the United States have been candle-related, occurring not during the storm, but in the days after, when the blackout stretched on and people were exhausted and not thinking clearly. The preparedness distinction here is specific. Battery-powered LED lanterns last far longer than candles and eliminate fire risk entirely. Rechargeable lanterns with solar panels can function indefinitely if sunlight is available. Headlamps free your hands. These are not expensive items. They are, however, items that tend to be bought the day before a predicted storm, which is also the day the hardware store sells out of them. The sixth thing your home loses is something that tends to arrive more slowly, but whose absence creates one of the most destabilizing experiences of an extended blackout. The sixth thing is the ability to cook hot food, and its absence changes the emotional texture of the emergency more than almost anything else. In the first 24 hours, cooking on a gas stove is still possible for many homes. Natural gas supply is typically maintained during a power outage because gas distribution does not depend on the electrical grid at the distribution level. However, many modern gas ranges use electronic ignition, which means the burners cannot be lit without power, at least not through the normal mechanism. Some people know that you can light a gas burner manually with a match or lighter even when the electronic ignition is dead. Many do not. Electric stoves and ranges are completely offline the moment power is lost. Induction cooktops, increasingly common in newer homes, are also dead. The microwave, the Instant Pot, the electric kettle, all of them are offline. What you are left with is whatever you can heat over an alternative heat source. A camp stove, a propane burner, a grill on the back porch. And this is where the propane problem appears. Most households own a gas grill. A significant percentage of those grills have a propane tank that is somewhere between empty and half full, because nobody checks the propane level until they are trying to start the grill at a summer cookout. During the opening hours of an emergency, propane tanks at hardware stores and gas stations tend to sell out or stop being available entirely. You cannot swap a tank you do not have. The deeper issue is that camp stoves and outdoor burners are not designed for all cooking contexts. Boiling water is easy. Cooking rice on a propane burner is manageable. Baking bread, heating a large pot of soup for a family, maintaining a simmer for a slow-cooked protein. These tasks become complicated, fuel-intensive, and at a certain point, impractical. The psychological dimension of hot food during a crisis is something that emergency researchers have documented extensively. Studies conducted after Hurricane Katrina found that the ability to prepare a warm meal was consistently rated by displaced families as one of the most significant factors in maintaining morale, a sense of normalcy, and the feeling that the situation was manageable. The absence of hot food is not just a physical deprivation. It is a signal, one that registers below conscious awareness, that the situation is out of control. Cold crackers and canned beans do the job nutritionally. They do not do the same job psychologically, which leads to the seventh thing your home loses during a long blackout, something that is even less physical than morale, but just as consequential. The seventh thing is medication viability, and for a significant portion of the American population, this is the most urgent issue on this entire list. The Centers for Disease Control reports that approximately 60% of American adults take at least one prescription medication. Of that group, a substantial portion are taking medications that require refrigeration. Insulin, certain biologics, liquid antibiotics, some hormonal medications, specific eye drops, and a range of specialty drugs used to treat autoimmune conditions. When the refrigerator loses power and begins to warm, these medications begin to degrade. Insulin is the most commonly discussed example, and it deserves the attention it receives. The American Diabetes Association's guidance is precise. Unopened insulin vials can be stored at room temperature for up to 28 days in most formulations. Opened vials should not be left at room temperature for more than 4 weeks. And even within that window, efficacy can be affected by temperature spikes above 86 degrees Fahrenheit. In a summer blackout where indoor temperatures climb past 90 degrees, that timeline compresses dramatically. But insulin is not the only concern. And in some ways, it is the one that families with diabetic members are most likely to have thought about. The medications that tend to slip through the preparedness gap are the ones people do not think of as temperature sensitive. Certain liquid anticonvulsants, some antipsychotic medications, specific formulations of thyroid hormone. Families managing complex medical conditions may have protocols for insulin, but may not have considered the full scope of what is in their refrigerator's medication drawer. The secondary medication issue during extended blackouts is the breakdown of the pharmacy supply chain. During major regional outages, pharmacies without backup power cannot access their dispensing computers, cannot process insurance, and cannot maintain the controlled temperature storage required by law for many medications. People who depend on weekly prescription refills can find themselves without access to critical medications within 4 to 5 days of a major event. The preparedness approach here is not complicated, but requires advanced conversation with a prescribing physician or pharmacist, asking about emergency supplies, understanding storage parameters, and knowing, before the emergency, what the actual degradation timeline looks like for each specific medication in the household. The eighth thing your home loses is something that is almost never on preparedness lists, even though its absence becomes impossible to ignore by day 2. The eighth thing is sewage function, and this particular failure has a way of making everything else feel more serious. Most urban and suburban homes are connected to a municipal sewer system. Wastewater leaves the home through gravity. You flush, and the waste moves downhill through a series of pipes to a treatment facility. In theory, this process does not require electricity at the household level. And for the first portion of the pipe network, that is true. But at certain points in every municipal sewer system, the terrain requires that wastewater be pumped uphill to maintain flow toward the treatment plant. These lift stations, also called pump stations, are electrically powered. When power is lost, lift stations switch to backup generators. When those generators run out of fuel or fail mechanically, the pumping stops. And when the pumping stops, the wastewater has nowhere to go. The result, in the most direct terms, is sewage backup. Depending on the layout of the local system and how many lift stations have gone offline, this can mean wastewater backing up into low-lying homes through floor drains and toilets. Or it can mean the gradual pressurization of the system to a point where flushing becomes impossible. Neither outcome is a minor inconvenience. After Hurricane Florence struck the Carolinas in 2018, multiple municipal wastewater systems experienced lift station failures, resulting in millions of gallons of untreated sewage entering local waterways and neighborhoods. The health implications from E. coli and other fecal pathogens were significant. Residents who had not prepared for this possibility faced not just the inconvenience of a non-functional bathroom, but a genuine contamination risk to their immediate environment. For homes on septic systems, the situation is different, but not necessarily better. Conventional septic tanks are gravity-fed and function without power. But homes with pump-assisted or aerobic septic systems require electricity to operate. And these systems are more common in newer construction than many homeowners realize. Discovering that your septic system requires power during the event, rather than before it, is a discovery that tends to produce a specific kind of alarm. The advanced preparation for this scenario is unglamorous but important. Knowing which type of system your home uses, having a portable toilet and waste bags on hand, and understanding the early warning signs of sewage system backup before it reaches the point of no return. The ninth thing your home loses is something that tends to hit hardest in the second and third day, and it is deeply underestimated. The ninth thing is personal hygiene capacity, and its loss creates a cascade of physical and psychological effects that can undermine an otherwise functional household. In the first 24 hours of a blackout, most households have enough hot water in their water heater to allow for 1 or 2 warm showers. After that, the tank begins to cool and the options narrow. Cold showers from a functioning supply are available in summer conditions, but can become genuinely dangerous in winter, particularly for elderly people, young children, or anyone with cardiovascular conditions. The stress of a cold shower in a cold house on the second morning of a blackout is not a minor discomfort. It is a disruption to a fundamental daily ritual that most people underestimate as a source of psychological stability. The deeper issue is what happens across multiple days when hygiene capacity is compromised. Oral hygiene becomes more complicated without a reliable water supply. Hand washing, particularly important for food safety and medical care, becomes a rationed activity when water pressure is uncertain. The skin irritation, headaches, and general physical discomfort that accumulate over 48 to 72 hours without normal hygiene access begin to affect sleep quality, mood, and decision-making. Preparedness research conducted by the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center has found that the maintenance of normal daily routines, including hygiene routines, is one of the most significant predictors of psychological resilience during extended emergency events. Families that can maintain some version of a normal morning routine, even in degraded form, show measurably better emotional stability and decision-making quality than families whose routines have completely collapsed. The hygiene preparedness kit that most guides describe: hand sanitizer, wet wipes, dry shampoo, a portable camp shower, a small propane water heater, is not glamorous material. It does not generate viral content, but in the context of a household that is now on day 3 of a blackout, with water pressure unreliable and no hot water, that kit is what keeps people feeling human when the circumstances are trying to convince them otherwise. The 10th thing your home loses is something that very few preparedness guides even acknowledge, even though it affects almost every practical decision made during an extended event. The 10th thing is financial access, and the way it disappears has a specific logic that is worth understanding before it happens to you. When the power goes out, ATM machines stop working. Point-of-sale terminals at gas stations, grocery stores, and pharmacies stop working. Electronic payment systems, which now handle the overwhelming majority of American consumer transactions, go offline along with everything else. What remains, for those who have it, is cash. The percentage of American households that keep meaningful amounts of physical cash at home has declined steadily over the past 2 decades. The Federal Reserve's Consumer Payment Study has documented this shift comprehensively. Cash payments now represent less than 20% of consumer transactions. and many households maintain little or no physical currency. The convenience economy has created a population that is financially liquid in electronic terms and financially fragile in physical terms. During the 2003 blackout that affected the northeastern United States and Canada, an event that left approximately 55 million people without power, cash became the de facto currency of emergency commerce almost immediately. Vendors who remained open could only accept cash. Gas stations with manual pumps and generators could sell fuel for cash only. The households that had even a modest emergency cash reserve, $200, $300 in small bills, had access to resources that cashless households simply could not reach. There is a specific and underappreciated detail about cash reserves that most guides miss. Denomination matters. A $100 bill is theoretically worth $100 at all times. During an emergency, a vendor who cannot make change and does not trust that you will return it is practically worthless. Small bills, 5s, 10s, 20s, function as real currency in emergency commerce. A $100 bill often does not. The companion issue to cash is fuel. Fuel is the resource that enables almost everything else during an extended blackout. Generator operation, transportation to resupply, the ability to evacuate if the situation deteriorates. Gas stations without power cannot pump fuel from underground tanks that require electric pumps, with the exception of those with backup generator systems. In a regional outage, the gas stations that can pump fuel will typically have lines extending for blocks within hours of the event. Households that enter an emergency with a full tank of gas and stored fuel for their generator are in a fundamentally different position than households that enter with an empty tank and a credit card. That brings us to the 11th thing your home loses during a long blackout. And this one is different from the others. It is not a system. It is not a resource. It is something less visible and more important. The 11th thing, and the one that ultimately determines how every other loss on this list gets handled, is the plan. Not a piece of paper. Not a checklist downloaded from a government website at some point and never looked at again. The plan is the shared understanding, held by everyone in the household, of what to do when each of these systems begins to fail. Who is checking on the elderly neighbor down the street? Who is the designated driver to the resupply point? Who knows where the emergency cache is? Who can operate the generator safely? And who is aware that a generator running inside a garage, even with the door open, is producing carbon monoxide at concentrations that can be fatal within minutes? The Consumer Product Safety Commission has documented that generator-related carbon monoxide poisoning spikes dramatically during and after every major blackout event. Portable generators should only ever be operated outside, at least 20 feet from any opening into the home. The CPSC's analysis of blackout-related CO poisoning deaths found that the majority occurred in enclosed or partially enclosed spaces, garages, covered porches, spaces that felt like outside to the person using them but were not, in terms of carbon monoxide accumulation. The plan covers this. The plan also covers who is responsible for medications, who has the family meeting point if communication fails, who knows the water shutoff location if a pipe bursts, and who has the critical documents, insurance cards, medical records, identification, in a portable container that can be grabbed in 60 seconds. Here is what makes the plan different from every other item on this list. Every other item is a thing you can buy. Temperature stability can be partially addressed with Mylar blankets. Water can be stored. Food can be stockpiled. Light can be provided by a $30 LED lantern. But the plan requires something that cannot be purchased. It requires a conversation. An honest, specific, slightly uncomfortable conversation that most families keep postponing because the lights are on and the refrigerator is running, and there is no urgency yet. The urgency arrives later. It arrives in the second hour when someone realizes they do not know where the manual can opener is. It arrives in the first night when the flashlight batteries are dead and nobody thought to have backups. It arrives in the third day when the generator is running out of fuel, and nobody knows where the nearest open gas station is, or whether there is cash in the house to pay for it. Preparedness is not about imagining worst cases. It is about deciding in advance that your household has thought through how it functions when the invisible infrastructure that holds modern life together temporarily stops holding. Every family that has been through an extended blackout and come out the other side without a serious problem did not get lucky. They had made decisions before the event that gave them options when options were scarce. The families that struggled were not less intelligent. They were not less capable. They simply believed at some level that the lights would come back on before the situation became difficult enough to require a plan. Sometimes the lights do come back on in time, but the question worth asking, and asking now, while the power is on and the thinking is easy, is what you would do if they did not. Because the next emergency is not on a schedule. It does not announce itself with enough warning to fill the bathtub, charge the power banks, and top off the gas tank. The ones that test households the most are the ones that arrive quietly, look manageable at first, and then reveal, item by item, everything that was never prepared for. That is the real list. Not 11 items, 11 categories of invisible dependence that every modern home carries. And that only become visible in the dark. If you have been watching this series, you already know that what disappears first during a crisis is rarely the thing people stockpile. In the next episode, we are going to look at the other side of this. Not what your home loses during a blackout, but what your pantry is actually worth when the grocery store closes. Because what most families keep in their pantry and what they actually need are two very different inventories. And the gap between them is where the real preparation work begins.